Look at the monitor. On the left side of your screen, the official ledger of global oil trade hums along, displaying a perfectly regulated, stable market. But on the right, leaked infrared satellite imagery tells a totally different story. Out there in the pitch black, a ghost armada of 300 unauthorized supertankers is currently moving 2.5 million barrels of crude oil. It is a massive, parallel global economy operating right in front of us, entirely uncontrolled by Western powers. You go to sleep every night trusting the stability of the US dollar to protect your savings and your standard of living. But that security is an illusion. While you work for your paycheck, this shadow fleet is actively dismantling the petrodollar system hour by hour, barrel by barrel. They are bypassing the fundamental financial architecture that keeps your currency valuable, replacing it with an unregulated, untraceable black market that operates completely outside of our jurisdiction. If this alternate maritime economy fully overtakes the mainstream energy market, the financial blowback will be irreversible. The resulting hyperinflation will decimate the purchasing power of your bank accounts in a matter of weeks, effectively wiping out the wealth of an entire generation. Ignorance of this shadow logistics network is not just a blind spot. It is a financial death sentence, and the architects of this system are counting on you looking the other way until it is too late. I am opening the archive and handing you the ultimate open-source intelligence playbook. Together, we will dissect the digital evidence to see the invisible operations of this rogue fleet. From identifying military-grade satellite spoofing signatures to unwinding the offshore money laundering networks, I will give you the analytical tools you need. You are going to track the real-time collapse of the global financial order right here, long before it ever makes the evening news. We start by pulling the live satellite telemetry over the Persian Gulf. Through the eyes of a maritime intelligence analyst, the glowing green tracks on the screen are the lifeblood of global commerce. Focus on that single moving icon. It represents a heavily laden oil tanker over 1,000 feet long and carrying hundreds of thousands of tons of steel and crude. It has just cleared the Port Authority limits, burning heavy fuel as it pushes out into the deep currents of the open water. The analyst watches the ship's trajectory update in real time, pinging the orbital network exactly as mandated by international protocol. But as the hull crosses a highly specific geographical coordinate, the transponder signal abruptly flaplines. No distress call, no weather anomaly. The tracking screen simply refreshes to empty water. A vessel the size of the Empire State Building has just vanished from the grid, leaving behind nothing but a digital ghost in the system's memory. To understand the scale of this crime, you have to look at the protocol. The Automatic Identification System, or AIS, is legally mandatory for all commercial vessels over 300 gross tons. This is not a polite suggestion. It is the fundamental law of the sea, designed to prevent catastrophic collisions in crowded shipping lanes. Turning off that transmitter is the maritime equivalent of driving a fully loaded freight train through a metropolis, blindfolded at midnight. Yet the data proves this is not a mechanical failure. At any given moment across the globe, up to 400 aging tankers are deliberately disabling their AIS transponders to vanish into the dark. They are purposefully severing their digital tethers to the legal world, creating a massive, coordinated blind spot for maritime authorities. This is a synchronized blackout, an organized evasion tactic executed by a fleet that technically should not even be allowed to leave the scrapyard. By operating entirely in this radar shadow, these rogue operators are systematically dismantling the enforcement mechanisms of global sanctions. When you have 400 massive ships running silent, you are no longer dealing with isolated smugglers. You are looking at a state-sponsored logistical bridge. They are moving staggering amounts of wealth through the darkest corners of the ocean, effectively rewriting the global supply chain, while Western regulators stare at empty screens. The raw transaction volume of this invisible trade is terrifying. When we cross-reference the satellite blind spots with leaked port data, the true scope of the hemorrhage becomes clear. In 2023 alone, intelligence estimates suggest over 800 million barrels of crude oil were transported entirely under the radar by these dark vessels. That is billions of dollars in illicit capital flowing outside the SWIFT banking system directly into the hands of sanctioned states. Think about the sheer physics required to move 800 million barrels of oil. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of ocean crossings, millions of metric tons of highly volatile cargo, and a deeply entrenched infrastructure of complicit buyers. Every single drop of that crude oil was pumped, loaded, and sailed across international waters without leaving a single trace on the official ledgers. It is a logistical miracle, engineered exclusively for global economic sabotage. The analyst sits back in the windowless office, staring at the synthetic aperture radar feed. The math simply does not add up to a mere loophole. The physical disappearance of a massive ship is not magic, and it certainly is not an accident. It is a deliberate, systemic hack of the entire global maritime infrastructure. We are witnessing a hostile takeover of the oceans, executed with a level of precision that renders our trillion-dollar naval surveillance networks completely useless. Which brings us to the ultimate flaw in the official narrative, the single question that breaks the illusion of our security. You can manipulate the digital registry, and you can route the wire transfers through a dozen anonymous offshore shell companies. But physical steel displaces water. So the paradox remains, demanding an answer before the entire financial system collapses. The concept of going dark is simple, but how do you actually hide an object the size of a skyscraper on the open ocean? The answer to hiding a 1,000-foot skyscraper on the open water is brutally elegant. You do not turn off the lights and hope no one notices. That method is already obsolete. The analyst stares at the glowing terminal screen, watching a Python script execute a continuous loop. The target tanker from our previous radar sweep did not just go dark. It did something far more dangerous. It started actively lying to the orbital satellites. Look closely at this digital map rendering the coast of West Africa. According to the official Maritime registry, a fully loaded supertanker is currently maintaining a steady speed of 12 knots through these waters. The automated tracking system provides a flawless data stream, coordinates, heading, and velocity. The mathematics of its presence are absolutely perfect. But I can tell you right now, there is nothing out there but empty ocean. This is the paradox of presence that keeps intelligence officers awake at night. The digital footprint is screaming that the vessel is off the African coastline, dutifully broadcasting its telemetry to Western regulators. Yet, physical reality dictates otherwise. The ship is mathematically broadcasting its location, but physically, thousands of tons of steel are half a world away. We are tracking a digital ghost through a compromised network. The analyst taps the keyboard, isolating the incoming radio frequency packets. To the untrained eye, this looks like a standard maritime broadcast. But when you strip away the graphical interface and look at the raw hex code, the anomaly reveals itself. The signal is too clean. The natural degradation caused by atmospheric interference is completely missing.
someone is feeding a synthetic reality directly into the global tracking grid.
Transponders are no longer just turned off, they are actively spoofed. Software generates entirely fake, mathematically perfect trajectories, tricking orbital satellites into registering the vessel up to 3,000 miles away from its true location. The shadow fleet is no longer hiding in the dark. They are hiding in plain sight by flooding our warning systems with fabricated data points, rendering the official map a complete fiction. Understand the sheer audacity of this operation. Spoofing a single coordinate on a smartphone is a parlor trick, but sustaining a dynamic, multivariable maritime trajectory for weeks, simulating weather corrections and ocean currents across a global satellite constellation, is a completely different beast. You cannot download a tool for this on the dark web. This requires profound computational power and unlimited operational funding. This level of continuous radio frequency signature manipulation requires military-grade algorithms. When I review the structural complexity of this synthetic data stream, I'm not looking at the work of independent smugglers or corporate pirates. This indicates heavy, unlimited subsidies and the direct operational involvement of hostile state intelligence agencies. The enemy has weaponized mathematics to blind Western enforcement. The implications of this algorithmic warfare are catastrophic for global enforcement. If you cannot trust the coordinates on the screen, the entire foundation of maritime law collapses. A sanctioned nation can park its entire armada right outside a restricted port, loading millions of barrels of illicit crude oil, while the official records show those exact same ships peacefully transiting a completely different hemisphere. But no matter how sophisticated the code becomes, the fundamental laws of physics still apply. The analyst refuses to be blinded by the digital deception. The digital tracker might be compromised, but a million-barrel payload cannot be transported through cyberspace. It requires a massive steel hull displacing thousands of tons of water. And if they are going to lie to the radio sensors, we have to change the optical spectrum we use to hunt them. The terminal screen goes black for a fraction of a second before rendering a completely different visual feed. To combat this state-sponsored spoofing, analysts now rely on synthetic aperture radar. Instead of passively listening for a transponder ping, this satellite actively fires targeted pulses of microwave radiation down at the ocean's surface, waiting to analyze exactly what energy signature bounces back to the orbital receiver. Microwaves do not care about Python scripts or fake GPS coordinates. They cut right through cloud cover, darkness, and digital lies. When the radar beam hits empty water, it scatters. But when it strikes the sharp right angles of a massive, manufactured metal structure, the energy bounces directly back to the lens. It detects the undeniable physical steel of the hull, regardless of what the underlying digital signals claim. A sudden brilliant white flash illuminates the dark monitor. It is a fresh synthetic aperture radar sweep over the Strait of Hormuz, exactly 3,000 miles away from the fake African coordinates. Right there, etched in stark microwave contrast, is the massive rectangular silhouette of our missing supertanker. It is physically moored to a clandestine terminal, rapidly loading sanctioned petroleum in total radio silence. We caught them, but the victory is chilling. The analyst downloads the radar image, adding it to a rapidly growing encrypted archive. For every ghost ship we force back into reality using microwave telemetry, 3 more vanish behind upgraded algorithms. It is a relentless, exhausting arms race. We are burning millions of dollars in satellite time just to prove that our basic tracking maps are fundamentally compromised. The radar gives us the physical location of the steel,
but it cannot tell us who profits from the cargo. This is where the investigation hits a bureaucratic brick wall. We have the coordinates of the crime, and we have the visual evidence of the loading procedure. Yet, when I pull the legal registration for this specific hull, the paper trail dissolves into a labyrinth of fresh ink, offshore jurisdictions, and fake corporate addresses.
Finding the ship is only the first layer of the deception. The true genius of the Shadow Fleet lies not in how they hide the steel, but in how they hide the money. The physical vessel is caught on radar, but legally, it belongs to an entity that defies all financial gravity. I need to show you how $100 million asset can vanish into a corporate void, shielded by a legal framework perfectly designed to protect the guilty.
We found the physical steel, but steel does not sign checks or wire funds. Inside this windowless government vault, the air is stale with the smell of printer toner and bureaucratic desperation. The financial intelligence officer stares at the radar printout from the Strait of Hormuz. We have the exact coordinates of a massive supertanker, loaded to the brim with sanctioned petroleum. But when you look at the legal registry, the ship you are looking at simply ceases to exist. The secure table is buried under stacks of corporate registrations, freshly printed from databases in Liberia and the Marshall Islands. A red marker connects one single, rusting hull to an absurd, tangled web of offshore paperwork. This is not a clerical error. It is a weaponized bureaucracy. The officer rubs their eyes, exhausted by the sheer volume of the deception. To track the money, you have to follow the paper trail. But this trail is designed to self-destruct.
Consider the immense gravity of this asset. A skyscraper-sized vessel carrying $50 million in crude oil requires massive capital, maintenance, and strict liability. Yet, legally it belongs to an entity that did not even exist 24 hours ago. This is the paradox of the disposable corporation. How do you prosecute a massive maritime crime when the multi-million-dollar weapon is legally tethered to a complete ghost? The entire global shipping industry runs on a very specific kind of trust: maritime insurance. If you cannot insure your hull against a catastrophic spill, no legitimate port authority will let you dock. To bypass these Western insurance blocks, the Shadow Fleet does not fight the law. It outruns it. They utilize a rapidly mutating network of pop-up shell companies. It is a corporate virus, constantly rewriting its own legal genetic code to evade financial antibodies. Every time intelligence agencies lock onto a suspicious vessel, the target morphs into something else. The officer circles a date on a crisp registration document. 6 different holding companies, all claiming ownership of the exact same ship, were incorporated on the exact same afternoon. It costs barely a few $1,000s to generate a new corporate identity, a trivial operating expense for a syndicate moving 1 billion barrels of illicit crude. You might ask why we cannot simply subpoena the documents and expose the ultimate beneficiaries driving this illicit trade. The mathematics of international law work directly against us. More than 70% of the entire Shadow Fleet is officially registered in jurisdictions with absolute, legally mandated financial opacity. We are not talking about simple offshore accounts. We are dealing with sovereign nations that sell corporate anonymity as their primary export. The officer points to a heavily redacted forensic flowchart. In these specific jurisdictions, the corporate veil is practically made of armor. There is no public registry of shareholders, no requirement to file annual returns, and no legal mechanism to force disclosure. It is not just exceptionally difficult to find the true owners of these massive ships. It is mathematically impossible to identify the ultimate beneficial owners
using conventional forensic accounting.
We are left staring at the perfect financial crime. We have the physical murder weapon, which is the ship, and we have the contraband. But the perpetrator is a phantom. It is a brilliant, cynical exploitation of Western legal frameworks. We built a global economy based on the sanctity of corporate ownership, and rogue nations have weaponized that exact principle against us, using the shield of limited liability to move sanctioned oil with total, terrifying impunity. The real nightmare begins when we actually win a battle. Let us assume the Treasury Department finally builds a bulletproof case against a specific vessel. They issue the ultimate financial death penalty, placing the ship and its holding company on the sanctions list. By all conventional logic, the vessel is now a toxic asset, permanently frozen out of the global market. The officer tosses the sanction protocol onto the desk. It is already completely useless. The entire shadow logistics system is rigged for immediate, automated evasion. When a ship is successfully flagged for sanctions by the Treasury Department, its ownership is systematically transferred to a newly minted shell company within 48 hours. The ink on our federal enforcement documents is not even dry before the target has completely shed its skin. This rapid transfer effectively resets its legal identity, instantly nullifying the enforcement action. Look at the sheer logistical coordination required for this legal maneuver. The exact moment the sanction hits the wire in Washington, lawyers in a tropical tax haven execute a pre-signed transfer agreement. The old company is liquidated, dissolved into the ether, and the new entity assumes control of the multi-million-dollar asset without missing a single delivery deadline. It is evasion running at the speed of light. We are fighting a corporate algorithm with paper forms. The officer leans back, staring at the chaotic red lines connecting the fake documents. This is not just a few rogue captains trying to make a quick profit on the black market. This is a sovereign-level infrastructure, funded and protected by state actors who have mapped every single vulnerability in the Western financial system. They know exactly how jurisdiction boundaries stall an investigation, and they exploit those blind spots with ruthless precision. The clock is constantly ticking against us in this windowless room. Every day that this dark network operates, millions of barrels of crude oil bypass the petrodollar system. That is billions of dollars moving through an invisible economy, funding regimes that are actively hostile to the West. And we are sitting here, buried under a mountain of fake paperwork, playing a global game of jurisdiction whack-a-mole that we are mathematically guaranteed to lose. The illusion of global control is shattering right in front of us. We genuinely thought we could regulate the oceans through insurance premiums and transparent corporate registries. But the shadow fleet has proven that if you have enough capital and a friendly flag state, you can simply opt out of the established rules. The legal paper trail is nothing but a decoy, a deliberate distraction designed to exhaust our analysts and waste our finite resources. We have chased the digital ghosts across satellite feeds, and we have chased the paper phantoms through offshore tax havens. But ultimately, you cannot digitize a physical barrel of oil. At some point, this colossal volume of sanctioned crude has to physically change hands, far away from the prying eyes of port authorities. To find the truth, we must leave the government vaults and follow the cargo out into international waters, where the real danger begins. The paper trail ends exactly where the deep water begins. We leave the suffocating air of the government vaults and follow the cargo out into the lawless expanse of international waters. We are tracking a newly re-registered, untrackable ship as it finally meets its clandestine buyer. This is the Malacca Strait at midnight. The sea is rough, the sky is pitch black, and the radar shows absolutely nothing. But through the thermal optics of an overhead drone, the invisible economy suddenly burns bright white. Below us, two massive supertankers, each over 1,000 feet long, are entirely painted in radar-absorbing black. They are running without a single navigation light, floating dangerously close, side by side, in the rolling ocean swells. This is not a glitch in the telemetry. This is a deliberate, highly coordinated rendezvous between a sanctioned phantom and a supposedly clean vessel. They are preparing to execute a maneuver that terrifies port authorities and environmental agencies alike. The anomaly here is not just the physical danger, but the profound economic paradox of ocean alchemy. I watch these two steel leviathans grind against each other in the dark and realize the ultimate question. How do you legally wash the origin of a sanctioned barrel of oil? You cannot simply forge a certificate of origin for a chemical compound that carries a specific geographic signature. The transaction requires a physical mechanism to definitively break the chain of custody. The thermal camera picks up the heat signature of thick, heavy rubber hoses being hoisted across the churning gap between the two hulls. This covert maritime operation is known in intelligence circles as a ship-to-ship or STS transfer. It is a brutal, mechanical process designed to bypass port inspections entirely. By moving the cargo on the open ocean, far beyond the 12-mile limit of territorial waters, they operate in a jurisdictional void where sovereign laws simply evaporate. The scale of this illicit transfer is a logistical nightmare. They are preparing to pump 2 million barrels of highly flammable crude oil between two unmoored vessels. It is a terrifying display of brute force logistics. The sheer kinetic energy of two fully loaded supertankers colliding in these swells is immense. It would be enough to tear the steel plating apart, unleashing an ecological catastrophe. Yet the crews execute this with chilling efficiency, operating entirely in the blind. This midnight offload is not a quick exchange. Transferring that staggering volume of viscous fluid takes up to 48 hours of precise, dangerous maneuvering. The crews intentionally seek out harsh weather conditions, using storms and heavy fog as natural camouflage to avoid the thermal sensors of naval patrol boats. For 2 straight days, they remain physically locked together. They become a floating bomb of hydrocarbons violently pitching in the open sea, completely invisible to the global market. I follow the heat signature of the crude oil as it flows through the heavy rubber hoses. This is the exact moment the crime is physically committed. The receiving ship is not empty. It already holds a partial cargo of legally sourced, fully documented crude oil. As the illicit fluid floods into the holding tanks, a violent, irreversible blending process begins. This is the true purpose of the dangerous rendezvous. They are not just moving the product, they are destroying the evidence on a molecular level. Every oil field on Earth produces a unique chemical signature and specific gravity, acting like a permanent geographic fingerprint. But the intentional mixing of sanctioned Iranian crude with legally sourced oil fundamentally masks that chemical makeup. The resulting hybrid fluid matches no single origin profile. By the time the hoses are disconnected, they have effectively turned illegal petroleum into a legally clean, untraceable commodity that can pass any rigorous customs inspection. The brilliance of this physical laundering is infuriating. If you track financial networks, you expect complex cryptography. But this is analog obfuscation operating on a massive industrial scale. The compliance officers in London and New York are searching for discrepancies in digital spreadsheets. Meanwhile, out here in the Malacca Strait,
The physical reality of the commodity is being rewritten. The paperwork matches the newly blended cargo perfectly. The origin story is legally flawless. As the sun begins to rise, the 48-hour operation finally concludes. The heavy rubber hoses are winched back, dripping toxic residue into the foaming water. The two blacked-out hulls slowly detach, ending their dangerous embrace. The original sanctioned Phantom, now riding high in the water, turns back toward the embargoed port to reload. But the second ship, the one carrying the newly synthesized, untraceable blend, switches its transponder back on. It rejoins the grid as a legitimate actor.
Watching that green dot reappear on the global tracking map is a masterclass in systemic deception. To the automated compliance algorithms sitting in Western banks, this vessel is completely clean. It has a verified insurance policy, a spotless corporate registry, and a cargo manifest that tests out as a legal, generic blend. The dirty origin has been thoroughly washed away by the churning waves of the ocean. The trap is set, and the global financial system is about to swallow the bait whole. We are watching a slow-motion collapse of international law. Every single day, dozens of these ship-to-ship transfers are executed in the blind spots of the world's oceans. Millions of barrels of untraceable energy are being injected directly into the veins of the global economy. The sanctions are not just failing. They are actively driving the creation of a vastly superior, decentralized logistics network. We built a digital wall, and they simply sailed underneath it in the dead of night. But securing a clean legal status for the oil is only the first half of the equation. Having a legally compliant cargo is completely useless unless you have a buyer capable of processing millions of gallons without asking questions. I watched the newly legitimized supertanker adjust its heading, accelerating away from the transfer zone. Its destination is not a transparent Western port. It is charting a course toward an entirely different industrial ecosystem, a massive consumer of this dark energy. Track this newly mixed, perfectly laundered cargo from the open ocean as it steams toward the global market's ultimate back door. The coordinates lock onto the eastern seaboard of Asia. You follow the wake of this ghost ship, expecting it to dock at a highly regulated multinational terminal. Instead, the paper trail leads you deep inland, far from the polished glass towers of corporate energy hubs. Through the lens of satellite surveillance, the destination reveals itself as a sprawling, independent industrial complex in rural China. Heavy, acrid black smoke billows continuously from a maze of industrial stacks. This is a teapot refinery. The freshly laundered oil from our midnight transfer is being unloaded right now, pumped into a rusted labyrinth of pipes with frantic, unceasing mechanical urgency. This brings us to the core anomaly of the shadow economy, the ultimate black hole of consumption. You have to ask yourself where exactly an illegal ocean of oil actually goes. A major Western energy corporation would flag the shipment in seconds, triggering compliance audits and seizing the asset. But this facility operates entirely outside that reality, acting as an insatiable vacuum for the world's embargoed crude. The scale of the operation completely defies traditional economic logic. You are watching a localized, independent facility devour massive quantities of energy that legally should not exist. The crude oil is processed at a blistering pace and immediately vanishes into a sprawling, opaque domestic supply chain. There are no export records, no transparent manifests, and absolutely zero communication with the banking grid. Look closely at the production outputs pulled from the latest geospatial intelligence reports. The telemetry data tells a terrifying story of pure industrial capacity. These independent refineries, entirely detached from the established global order, are not minor players in this clandestine game. They are the apex predators of the shadow market, consuming the embargoed commodity with a terrifying, unstoppable efficiency.
The intercepted daily logs confirm the mathematical reality of the threat. Independent refineries, universally referred to as teapots in intelligence circles, process up to 2.5 million barrels of sanctioned oil every single day. This is an astronomical volume of energy changing hands in the dark. They completely bypass the traditional multinational energy corporations that have controlled global petroleum flow. Processing 2.5 million barrels every single day provides enough physical energy to power entire nations, moving silently through an underground logistical network. The investigator inside you searches for the pressure point, the vulnerability where international law can strike a fatal blow. The standard protocol for the Treasury Department is to deploy the crushing threat of secondary sanctions to stop the trade.
But the bureaucratic threat simply bounces off a reinforced brick wall. When you pull the financial profiles of these teapot refineries, the offshore ledgers are completely blank. There are no holding accounts hidden in Manhattan. There are no subsidiary branches operating in London. The entire mechanism of Western economic warfare relies on the target having something to lose in the Western financial system. Because these hyper-localized industrial facilities lack international financial exposure or U.S. dollar-denominated assets, they possess a lethal structural advantage. They are mathematically immune to the secondary sanctions imposed by Western governments. You cannot freeze a bank account that does not exist in your jurisdiction. You cannot block a transaction when the buyer refuses to use your currency in the first place.
The realization hits with the cold force of a physical blow to the chest. The entire architecture of global sanctions is built on the arrogant assumption that every participant needs the dollar to survive. These refineries prove that assumption is a fatal error. They have built an alternative industrial ecosystem, fully self-contained and heavily shielded from external economic pressure, buying the asset at a massive discount. We have uncovered the terminal node of an entirely new, unassailable global economy, operating right under the nose of the Western Intelligence Alliance. If this scale of geopolitical subversion blows your mind too, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Do you think the old financial empire ever stood a chance against this level of decentralized evasion? Let me know your read on the situation down in the comments.
The investigation unequivocally proves that the Shadow Fleet is not just a loose collection of rogue ships. It is a highly coordinated, end-to-end supply chain built for resilience. From the dark vessels loading crude in the Persian Gulf to the offshore shell companies laundering the legal ownership straight into the furnaces of these immune teapot refineries. The loop is closed, achieving total logistical independence. You review the thermal satellite imagery one more time. The intense heat signatures from the stacks are a clear indicator of maximum capacity. The more the West tightens its grip on the official oil market, the more these independent refineries thrive. They are gorging on the sanctioned crude, refining it into diesel and jet fuel, and feeding an industrial superpower. The embargo merely subsidized a geopolitical rival. The timer is aggressively counting down on American financial supremacy. Every barrel processed by these independent teapots represents liquid capital drained permanently away from the petrodollar system. The compliance officers in Washington are fighting a ghost, writing sanctions against entities that operate in a parallel universe.
The physical reality on the ground is mocking the legal authority of the banking sector. But a critical, glaring question remains completely unanswered on the ledger. Even if these teapot refineries are completely immune to dollar-based sanctions, they still have to pay for 2.5 million barrels of oil every single day. That requires a staggering amount of liquid capital. If they are not wiring US dollars through New York clearinghouses, what exactly is the currency fueling this massive shadow empire? The physical oil has been burned in the furnaces of independent refineries, but the financial ledger remains wide open. I must follow the payment backwards, tracing the flow of capital completely outside the established banking system. To the financial intelligence officer staring at a glowing screen in a secure vault, the total absence of a wire transfer is the ultimate red flag. You are looking at a billion-dollar transaction that theoretically never happened. On the digital ledger visualizing cryptocurrency transactions, the countdown to collapse has already begun. A local bank in Dubai converts yuan into a digital stablecoin, completely bypassing the New York clearinghouses. The digital tokens flash across the screen, settling a massive trade in mere milliseconds. This is not a glitch in the software. This is an irreversible hemorrhage in the global financial system, unfolding in real time. The anomaly on the evidence board is staggering. The ghost money creates a terrifying logistical paradox. How do you pay for $1 billion cargo of crude oil when you are mathematically locked out of the United States banking network? The answer lies in the chilling realization that the traditional financial weapons are firing blanks. The adversary simply stopped playing on our board and built an entirely new, encrypted casino. To understand the sheer scale of this economic threat, I had to look at the foundational architecture of global power. For half a century, the entire concept of the petrodollar has relied on a singular, unbreakable rule. Global energy trades must be settled exclusively in United States currency. This engineered geopolitical monopoly forces the entire world to hold massive dollar reserves just to keep their domestic economies functioning. This mandatory global demand for the dollar is the absolute lifeblood of American hegemony. It allows the Treasury Department to weaponize access to the international market. The intelligence officer knows the protocol. If a nation steps out of line, you cut their access to the SWIFT messaging system, and their economy suffocates within days. But when you analyze the raw data streaming from these offshore clearing networks, that foundational logic is collapsing. The Shadow Fleet operates on entirely alternative payment rails, rendering the traditional embargo totally obsolete. I'm tracking a synchronized matrix of financial evasion. The intelligence feeds show the active utilization of cross-border yuan settlements, untraceable physical gold swaps, and billions of dollars moving seamlessly through algorithmic stablecoins. The illicit transaction settles before the compliance algorithms even boot up for the morning. Look closely at the blockchain forensics running on the terminal screen. A dark tanker unloads its cargo in the dead of night, and simultaneously, a smart contract executes on a server in Dubai. The stablecoin is pegged to the dollar to maintain predictable value, but it moves on decentralized ledgers completely outside the jurisdiction of Western regulators. The paper trail is replaced by cryptographic hashes that recognize no borders and obey no sanctions. When the digital networks are deemed too visible or too risky, the operators simply revert to the oldest currency in human history. The intelligence officer tracks heavily guarded cargo planes flying a continuous loop between Moscow, Tehran, and the Emirates. They're moving physical gold bullion to settle the massive oil debts. This analog transaction leaves absolutely zero digital footprint. You cannot freeze a pallet of gold sitting in a sovereign, heavily fortified vault. Then there is the bureaucratic infrastructure of the cross-border yuan trade. By establishing bilateral currency swap agreements, these rogue nations completely circumvent the need for foreign exchange markets dominated by Western banks. The transaction is cleared locally, subsidized by state-owned financial institutions that have specifically insulated themselves from international exposure. The United States dollar is simply, surgically cut out of the equation. The cumulative effect of these ghost transactions is a catastrophic structural failure for American economic dominance. By 2024, financial intelligence estimated that nearly 20% of all global oil transactions completely bypassed the United States dollar. Let that devastating statistic sink in for a moment. 1/5 of the planetary energy market has successfully migrated into the shadows, operating with absolute impunity.
This is not a temporary anomaly or a desperate workaround by cornered regimes. This structural shift permanently weakens the currency that underpins the entire Western standard of living. 20% is the critical, irreversible threshold. When a parallel economy reaches this level of volume, it becomes entirely self-sustaining. The shadow market is actively acquiring the liquid capital it needs to completely decouple from the established global financial order.
From the perspective of the financial intelligence officer watching the digital stablecoins clear the ledger, the existential dread is palpable. The old weapons are fundamentally broken. You can sanction a pop-up shell company. You can seize an aging tanker in port, but you cannot sanction a decentralized mathematical protocol. You cannot issue a subpoena to an anonymous blockchain wallet that processes $1 billion of sovereign wealth in total, deafening silence. This decentralized financial evasion triggers a terrifying, unstoppable domino effect. As fewer nations are forced to buy dollars to secure their energy supplies, the global demand for United States Treasury bonds plummets. The artificial support holding up the Western debt structure begins to fracture. Every algorithmic token traded for a barrel of sanctioned crude accelerates the erosion of the financial gravity that holds the modern empire together.
The undeniable evidence of collapse is buried deep in the metadata of these instantaneous transfers. The Shadow Fleet is not merely a clandestine logistics network. It is the physical battering ram breaking down the reinforced gates of the global financial system. The local bank in Dubai acts as a newly fortified outpost in an economic war where the front lines are entirely invisible to the naked eye. The transactions are flawless, leaving the banking sector scrambling in the dark. The financial loop is definitively closed, and the new geopolitical bloc has achieved total monetary independence. But this rogue, unregulated system comes with a devastating physical cost. The capital flows freely through the ether, but the decaying steel of the Ghost Armada remains a ticking time bomb on the open ocean. As the money disappears into the encrypted void, the rusty, uninsured hulls carrying this illegal cargo are heading straight toward an inevitable catastrophe. As the digital money vanishes into the encrypted void of alternative ledgers, a terrifyingly physical reality remains on the water. The abstract economic war you have been tracking just mutated into an irreversible environmental countdown. We are no longer just looking at a threat to the global financial system. The true cost of this parallel economy is measured in thousands of tons of decaying, stressed steel pounding against the ocean swells. The maritime intelligence analyst stares at a heavily redacted synthetic aperture radar feed off the coast of Greece.
The telemetry shows a massive, 30-year-old supertanker struggling to maintain its heading in a severe Mediterranean storm. Every time the hull crests a massive wave and slams into the trough, the brutal laws of physics test the compromised structural integrity of the ship. The groaning of the steel is deafening, yet legally, this vessel is a ghost.
This is the ultimate anomaly in our investigation, the corpse we are watching decompose in real time. We have established how you hide the money and how you launder the cargo. But what happens when a piece of critical infrastructure that legally does not exist simply cracks in half and sinks? The answer is an uninsured apocalypse, a scenario where the devastating physical evidence of the crime washes up on the shores of sovereign nations. To understand the immediate danger, I dug into the global maritime scrapping protocols. In a legitimate, regulated market, high-tensile steel has a strict expiration date. Ocean salt water is a relentless corrosive agent, and the constant cyclical loading of waves naturally degrades the structural integrity of a massive hull. When a legitimate tanker reaches the end of its operational lifespan, it is carefully decommissioned and stripped for parts to mitigate the risk of catastrophic failure. The evidence gathered from port inspection archives paints a terrifying picture. The average age of a vessel currently operating in this shadow fleet exceeds 20 years. These ships have been pushed far past the standard industry scrapping age, deliberately kept on the water by shadow operators because new ships are impossible to purchase under the current sanction regime. We are watching the exponential probability of severe metal fatigue become an absolute certainty. Through the analyst's monitor, the danger is no longer abstract math. It is a microscopic crack forming in the ship's aging steel plating. This is not a sudden accident, but a slow, predictable failure of materials physics. Decades of microfractures, exacerbated by a total lack of dry dock maintenance and skipped safety inspections, are finally coalescing into a critical structural breach. The ocean does not care about offshore shell companies. It only respects structural integrity. Legitimate maritime logistics rely on an ironclad bureaucracy of risk management. If a regulated tanker breaches its hull, a massive international network of protection and indemnity clubs immediately deploys billions of dollars for containment and cleanup. There is a clear paper trail, a designated beneficiary, and an underwriter legally obligated to pay for the ecological damage. It is a highly scrutinized financial safety net designed to protect the global coastlines. The intelligence analyst cross-references the ghost ship's transponder data with global underwriting registries, and the result is a chilling blank slate. These vessels operate entirely without international safety certifications or standard protection and indemnity insurance. Because the ships are registered to disposable, zero-transparency shell companies, there is absolutely zero financial safety net in the event of a catastrophic structural failure on the open ocean. The architecture of this liability is brilliantly cynical. If this rusting behemoth breaks apart in the storm, the anonymous owners will simply execute a pre-planned legal protocol. Within minutes, the offshore shell company claiming ownership of the vessel will be dissolved. The servers will be wiped. The untraceable crypto wallets will be emptied, and the legal entity responsible for the ship will vanish into the ether, leaving behind nothing but a colossal ecological disaster. The sheer volume of the threat is staggering to comprehend. We are not talking about a minor leak from a local barge. This specific ghost tanker is currently carrying a massive payload of 2 million barrels of sanctioned crude oil, heavily mixed with caustic chemical additives to mask its origin. That is over 84 million gallons of highly toxic, flammable sludge
resting on a structurally compromised steel plate barely an inch thick, suspended above fragile marine ecosystems. A single catastrophic spill involving a dark vessel carrying 2 million barrels of crude oil would instantly result in hundreds of billions of dollars in uninsured damages. It would dwarf the most infamous maritime disasters in recorded history. With no international insurance fund to tap into and no legal entity to sue for negligence, the financial burden of this disaster immediately shifts to the victim. Local governments are left to bear the total cost of the devastation alone.
I reviewed the disaster response budgets for the coastal nations situated along these clandestine shipping lanes. None of them possess the liquid capital required to mitigate an oil slick of this unprecedented magnitude. A spill from a shadow fleet vessel means immediate bankruptcy for regional municipalities. The fishing industries will be permanently wiped out, the tourism sectors will collapse, and the entire cost of the environmental remediation will fall directly on the local taxpayers. This is the darkest, most cynical transaction of the entire shadow economy. The rogue nations and their clandestine beneficiaries secure the massive profits from the illegal oil trade while completely socializing the devastating physical risks. They have successfully hacked the global financial system to extract billions in untraceable wealth while deliberately outsourcing the inevitable environmental apocalypse to the innocent coastal populations positioned along their transit routes. The OSINT analyst watches the radar feed as the storm off the coast of Greece intensifies. The blinking dot representing the distressed supertanker flickers sporadically. The intelligence protocols and the satellite sweeps can only observe the impending doom. They cannot intervene to prevent the structural collapse. This is the ultimate horrifying evidence of the investigation. The economic war has bypassed the ledgers and is now threatening the very geography of the real world. You thought the collapse of the petrodollar was just numbers on a screen, a distant geopolitical shift that only impacted central bankers. But the true cost of this new world order is measured in the toxic black tide waiting to wash up on your shores. As the microscopic crack in the 30-year-old steel continues to widen under the crushing weight of the Mediterranean storm, the final illusion of safety shatters. The shadow fleet is no longer just stealing money. It is destroying the Earth. The screen goes dark on the Maritime tracking feed, and the storm off the coast of Greece swallows the failing hull of another anonymous vessel. But that impending ecological disaster is merely the physical manifestation of a much deeper catastrophe. We spent months chasing ghosts across the digital ocean, but as I pull back the lens from the Aegean Sea, the true wreckage becomes visible. The real casualty of this covert war is the absolute, irreversible obsolescence of Western financial power. On one side of the global ledger, the Federal Reserve continues to deploy traditional economic weapons to maintain control. We believed our sanctions were an impenetrable fortress. That doctrine relies entirely on a single premise, that access to the United States financial system is an indispensable necessity for survival. But out there, on the dark waters, hundreds of ghost ships move silently, completely detached from our banking system. The financial weapon fundamentally failed. What began as a desperate evasion tactic by isolated nations has mutated into something far more terrifying. This is no longer a temporary anomaly or a makeshift smuggling ring. The Shadow Fleet has evolved into a permanent parallel infrastructure that services an entirely new geopolitical bloc. I tracked the digital breadcrumbs from the Persian Gulf to the teapot refineries, and the verdict is undeniable. They are not hiding from our financial system. They are actively replacing it. The evidence is irrefutable. by successfully moving millions of barrels of crude oil every single day without a single US dollar changing hands. This rogue armada has provided a mathematically proven blueprint for total financial independence from the West. They have shown every dissenting nation that the petrodollar is a paper tiger. We are in the year 2026, witnessing the permanent alteration of global power. The case is closed on American financial hegemony. You must understand the sheer scale of this strategic failure. We spent decades perfecting our economic arsenal, assuming that threatening to cut off banking access was the ultimate deterrent. But what is the point of a financial weapon if the enemy has built an entirely different battlefield? The sanctioned states watched our moves and engineered a decentralized maritime network that renders our Treasury Department completely blind. The old rules of global engagement have been permanently rewritten. At the beginning of this investigation, you likely believed your standard of living was protected by the unquestionable gravity of the US dollar. You trusted the ledgers and the official data feeds, but those screens are lying to you. Every time a ship spoofs its coordinates, every time a shell company vanishes in the Marshall Islands, a fraction of your purchasing power is quietly erased. The shadow economy is not just happening out there on the ocean. It is happening directly to your future. We are already living in the aftermath of the crash. The shockwave simply has not reached the financial district yet. This parallel economy, fueled by algorithmic stablecoins and untraceable crude, operates with terrifying mechanical precision. The architecture of the old world, the clearinghouses in New York, the regulatory frameworks, are now obsolete monuments to a bygone era. They built a system mathematically immune to our laws, and we handed them the blueprints through our own arrogance. This investigation forces a brutal realization. Empires do not fall because their armies are defeated. They collapse when their currency loses its mathematical authority. We assumed the world needed us, but the global market is a cold, indifferent algorithm that reroutes around obstacles. The Shadow Fleet is that reroute. 2.5 million barrels a day, sliding flawlessly through the cracks of our sanctions. It is a masterpiece of evasion, and it signals the end of the American century. I sit in this windowless room, surrounded by glowing synthetic aperture radar feeds and stacks of redacted transfer locks, and I feel a profound exhaustion. We mapped every shell company, flagged every spoofed signal, and tracked every illicit barrel. But intelligence is useless without action, and our institutions are paralyzed by their own bureaucracy. We built a machine to catch criminals, but we accidentally captured the raw, unstoppable evolution of global commerce. The old tools are dead. If this investigation has shattered your illusions about the global economy, hit the like button. That is our telemetry, proving we are exposing the right nerve. Go into the comments right now and tell me, how long do you think the petrodollar can survive against this decentralized math? If you want to continue deciphering the real rules of the modern world before they make the evening news, subscribe to the channel. The case remains open, and we need every analyst on deck. The digital map flickers as another massive supertanker kills its transponder, vanishing into the economic void. The United States dollar is no longer the undisputed king of the world. It is merely a hostage to a shadow fleet that refuses to play by the rules. We are entering an era of absolute financial anarchy, and the regulatory radar is entirely blind. The investigation is complete, but the collapse has just begun. Signing off.